up, Badlands. Explain those Badlands. That's a hell of a name.
Good evening and welcome to the No Treason Podcast. This is episode 15. I'm your host, Jonathan Drake. Welcome back, everyone. This is a pre-record. I will have to be at work when this airs, but I should be able to be mingling with you all in the chat. Nice to have a little bit of a break from reality for a while, although I did find I missed doing the show. Missed you all. And missed talking about this awesome stuff. I was with some friends and family on a little bit of vacation, and they were primarily of the normie variety. So it was a rather conversationalist wasteland, and I can only take so much of that, but it was still nice to get out of the normal routine of things. Appreciate you all being patient, and I think we should get back right on into it with trial by jury. For those of you who might just be tuning in, you would benefit from doing some catch up, understanding Lysander Spooner's perspective on the world. He was a lawyer back in the 1800s in Massachusetts of the anarchist variety. I don't think he was really ever successful actually as a lawyer, but that was something that he was certainly interested in, was the philosophical underpinnings of law itself and not just regurgitating what the legal system tells you to think. He wrote some essays that we've been going through. The first one was No Treason, the Constitution of No Authority. That was episodes 1 through 10, in which we discussed his reasons for why the Constitution is not a valid contract, is not binding on anyone, and if it is to be preserved for anything, it's simply as a monument to the folly and wickedness of mankind. And if that's something that is an affront to your sensibilities, I encourage you to read the essay. It should be in the link, a link in the description to a free PDF. It's available for you. You can also listen back to the episodes and understand why such a provocative thing would even be dared to be spoken in today's day and age. I think you'll find his argument is compelling if you are honest with yourself. The next thing we're going through right now, we are 5 episodes, or this will be the 5th episode into it, is his essay written in 1852, Trial by Jury, in which he explores the historical practice of trial by jury. We think we have it today. We don't. We have the shell. It has been redefined numerous times and has had all sorts of layers of legal mumbo jumbo added on top that have completely stripped it of the power that it is meant to have, as it was historically referred to as the Palladium of Liberty. It is in discussing trial by jury, it's a comparison between trial by jury or country and trial by government. What we have today is trial by government, not trial by jury. We, in the first couple of episodes, discussed the Tina Peters case, which obviously recently had some interesting developments. And what her case demonstrates is how the government, through its avatar of a judge, takes the prerogative of what should be the jury and takes that away from them, tells them what to think, how to think, why to think, and pretty much what to say. The jury is supposed to adjudicate not just the person accused, but the law itself. That's how it is the palladium, the protection, the security of liberty, in that we as the people, you and I will never have access to the halls of Congress, we will never be, odds are, never be president, never be a senator, never be a congressman, never be a state senator, a governor, etc. And so this is a way where we, the plebs of society, can actually have access to the levers of power, because on a jury, you can vote to acquit somebody, even if they've broken the actual law, the law as it is written, it's undisputed, the facts are clear, but you decide, that doesn't really, that law is not in line with liberty. And you, as a member of the jury, historically and by natural right, have the authority to say, no, we're not going to convict somebody and take away their liberty through that law. More than anything, I believe the deep state, the global regime, whatever you want to call it, the centralizing powers that would be, they hate trial by jury, which is why they've pushed so hard for us to get to approach things from the election standpoint. That's something they can easily control. It's not as much of a roll of the dice as trying to convince a jury that a law should be a law. And so I think it's incumbent on us to revitalize this historical practice that goes back well into the Roman occupation of Germania. These were cultural ideas that existed before the Romans invaded that part of the world. And then as these ideas mature, they seem to have come into full adulthood in the Anglo Saxon period. And that is what we're going to be discussing tonight. But by way of recap of last episode, we began our look into the historical foundation for trial by jury by beginning our examination of the most significant historical record of the practice in Magna Carta. Magna Carta, the hard-fought 1215 contract between the barons and the people and then King John, was a codification that appealed to already ancient cultural values, as I just mentioned. It goes back to the days of the in Germania, in the days prior even to the Roman invasion. And as I mentioned, they reached fruition or full maturity during the time of the Anglo-Saxons, but then they were usurped by the Norman invasion of England just 150 years or so, a little less than that, prior to Magna Carta being signed. Understanding how the bottom-up Anglo-Saxon system, exemplified by trial by jury, so understanding how that system was inherently incompatible with their top-down totalitarian ambitions, the Normans quickly gutted the heart and soul of the only true of for and by the people mechanism of maintaining government by consent, which was a hallmark of that Anglo-Saxon system. In a move that would be echoed centuries later when Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story did the same in the 1800s, or in the 1830s. And this, by the way, should call to mind the frequent discussion of Chris Paul's idea of history essentially being a series of reruns of narrative patterns. So Joseph Story echoes that the Normans were savvy enough to maintain at least the narrative form of the localized legal structure that produced trial by jury, a form that was maintained via solemn oaths to honor and guard the ancient laws, which weren't followed. And that should bring to mind Spooner's discussion and thoughts on the efficacy of oaths at keeping tyrants at bay. And if you are interested in a more thorough discussion of that, you can go back and check out episode 6, titled Secret Ballots, Oaths to the Wind, and the Illusion of Consent. By forcibly replacing Anglo-Saxon elites with Norman nobility loyal to the increasingly dominant crown, the Norman royalty were able to effect a hostile takeover that thoroughly stripped away the military protections of a society that from at least the time of the Romans celebrated the freedom that comes with personal sovereignty, and they fiercely defended it. The Anglo-Saxons, that is, until the Normans came and put the smack down. Power is power at the end of the day, unfortunately, and so is money. All political power, as it is called, rests on the matter of money. So unfortunately, the Normans were able to bring more soldiers. But we're trained to believe that this era, the so-called Dark Ages, was a black hole for human liberty. But surviving records, which Spooner leans heavily on, and we'll look at some of those tonight, show a flourishing system of personal sovereignty exemplified by private land ownership and individual legal autonomy, concepts defined, preserved in the term of allodial, A-L-L-O-D-I-A-L, ownership. This is ownership that was free from any feudal obligations, rent, or service, beyond a legitimate moral responsibility to participate in the only true grassroots legal process that preserved the rights inherent in political liberty. In other words, service on a jury was mandatory. It was part of being in good standing with the community. And this applied to all free men, of which there were quite a few. So if you wanted to torpedo your social standing, then you would refuse to be on a jury. We discussed how, in spite of its lofty and necessary goals, Magna Carta was a failure in that it was nullified within 3 months. Once King John received word from Pope Innocent III that he had papal blessing to do so. But then, although the charter was reaffirmed numerous times over the centuries, I think it's 30-ish or somewhere in that range. I came across that figure. I don't have it stored on the top of the brain. But being reaffirmed, thus preserving the legal language that trial by jury was still technically a thing, its gradual replacement by supposed representative government in the form of the British Parliament slowly eroded public awareness of the benefits of utilizing trial by jury to resoundingly reject progressively insistent tyranny. The idea there is, we're represented, we're all good, they've got this. The problem is, if you think of an analogy, I've heard if something happens to someone and 911 needs to be called, when you go through training for that, rather than if you're the person that's there and maybe you're trying to stop bleeding or something and you can't grab your phone, instead of saying someone call 911, they train you to point to someone who has a phone and say, you call 911, because otherwise you have 5 people standing there with the phones and everyone else assumes that someone else will call 911, and then you lose precious time as no one calls it. So it's better to point to someone specific and say, you call 911. That's the personal responsibility aspect of it. And unfortunately, when things are codified, it seems to, this is another narrative rerun that we observe a number of times throughout history. This happened with the Magna Carta in 1215. It happened with the Constitution 250 years ago. But that when it's codified and written down and then the job is sort of given to someone else, the human nature tendency is to forget about it and then grow complacent. And hey, here we are having to revisit these things because we're in a big mess. So because the language of trial by jury has been thus preserved, the global regime forces are able to make great fanfare and solemn head nods to celebrate it and dupe people into believing that in spite of the reality on the ground, we are what those historical documents claim we are, which obviously is just not true. We've been bait and switched. And that's because you cannot redefine something and claim it's still the same thing. By way of corny dad jokes, my granddad enjoyed telling this joke way back in the day that the Smithsonian Institute has on display George Washington's original hatchet of cherry tree fame. And then, as my granddad would tell it, the handle has been replaced 3 times, the head twice, but it's the original hatchet. All corniness aside, this is identical in concept, at least, to what has been done to our legal system, so that the governor of Colorado can solemnly declare that Tina Peters has been convicted by a jury of her peers, as if that means anything in the system that we have today. So tonight we're going to continue the historical exploration, but instead of following linearly Spooner's logical progression that he puts in his essay, I decided to kind of skip around. We're going to, the next step after what we covered last episode, which was discussing the Magna Carta, he dives into the Latin language nitty gritty of Magna Carta, which is important, and I'm sure we'll touch on at some point. But tonight we're going to go ahead and skip ahead to Chapter 3, Section 1. And Chapter 3 is titled Additional Proofs of the Rights and Duties of Jurors. But first, we have a word from our very good friends at Rise Attire.
What is the Sovereign Alliance? The Sovereign Alliance are a collection of leaders and countries that are aligned not in the vision for their countries, but against a vision that has been thrust upon them. I believe that the Sovereign Alliance is less a battle for something and more a battle against something. They are against globalism, collectivism. They are against the rules-based international order.
Sovereign Alliance, the latest addition to Badlands Rise merch, available now at badlandsmedia.tv/rise.
And then, are you looking for a better alternative to the over-the-counter drugstore medications? Tamarac Garden began from a parent's desperate need for safe and effective options for their kids, tired of toxic chemicals. Taking matters into their own hands, how dare they? They began crafting medicine from weeds, wildflowers, and herbs, the original time-tested healers that modern medicine can't match. Packed with antiviral herbs to boost immunity and fight illness, Tamarac Garden has, for a limited time, their elderberry and rose hips syrup kit available. Not only is it delicious, no more battles with kids, and easy to make, it will keep you and your family healthy all fall and winter. Introducing Tamarac Garden's new baby line, clean, non-toxic, and gentle for newborns and moms, relieving cradle cap, diaper rash, stretch marks, and postpartum pain. Visit tamaracgarden.com today. Use promo code BADLANDS for $10 off orders over $50. Remember to eat your weeds. tamaracgarden.com, promo code BADLANDS. And last, but certainly not least,
get you some of that beard oil.
Now that I'm alone, got the close up. Do you see how awesome my beard looks right now?
I use the beard oil every single day. First thing, comes out feeling all silky smooth. I take the dropper and I manually apply the oil directly to my mustache. Nice and, oh man, I love it. And then I do drops all throughout the hair, and then I just rub it all in. And then I top it off with the tallow stick on the face.
Dude, I feel like I have to grow a beard just to try this beard oil. It sounds
Do it, Jay.
amazing.
It's all from softdisclosure.com, and the best part about it is you will be supporting Badlands Media, Annie from Willowwind Farms, and basically 3 of Annie's neighbors. So that's 5 total American companies that you'd be supporting with one purchase.
I have been using the Soft Disclosure scentless beard oil every day after the shower. It looks unkempt, but it feels silky smooth. I want to look a little wild and unapproachable, but for the woman I trust, she'll be like, oh, it's actually kind of soft. He is approachable after all. Otherwise, stay away. And Soft Disclosure will help you too with that, if that's the very specific vibe you're going for.
That is very specific, yes. You guys are supporting American businesses when you do that. It's absolutely incredible, and you get a great, great product.
I love how in that ad spot, it really does seem like Burning Bright has no idea what the next word is going to be. He just keeps going and is proud of his ability to weave like that. But yeah, I like I said, I've been using the beard oil too. I'm a big fan for sure. And I have to be careful not to let my dogs try to give me kisses on right after I put it on, because they're all like, "Whoa, that smells pretty good." You get that beef tallow, and they want some, but you gotta push them away. So burning brights attracting his wife, and my dogs are attracted to me. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop there because I don't have weave powers, and I don't want to get myself into trouble. All right. Chapter 3 of Trial by Jury, additional proofs of the rights and duties of jurors. And we're going to start in section 1. And one of the additional proofs is the title, Weakness of Regal Authority. The next section, which we'll go into next week, is the ancient common law juries were mere courts of conscience, which is a big deal. But if you recall, the first proofs we discussed were Spooner's logical deduction from the events surrounding Magna Carta itself. And I just realized I forgot to check my audio, and okay, good. Whew. I had unplugged my I got a little interface here, and I had unplugged it and plugged it back in. And last time that happened was around the time StreamYard was screwing up and put me in a tin can, and that'd be tragic. So I figured I may as well check that out before we go any further. But anyway, if you recall, the first proofs that we discussed were Spooner's logical deduction from the events surrounding Magna Carta itself. And then rewinding a little bit before that, the first couple of episodes were just describing what the jury process should be. And then everything we've done since then is just elaborate on Spooner's justification for that description being the description it needs to be. Spooner argued in the discussion on Magna Carta that it makes no sense in pushing back against the claim that trial by jury versus trial by government, that this is a modern invention and then projection back onto Magna Carta. He argues that it makes no sense for the barons to have fought, won, and then having the upper hand over King John, just simply turn his kingdom back to him exactly as they had taken it. That doesn't make any sense. The second proof was that King John's recorded response clearly indicated that trial by jury, preserved in Clause 39 of Magna Carta, was particularly distressing to him, and he was able to draw on contemporary writers of that time. So this isn't even recording information from decades or centuries later. This is actual source material of that time, of chroniclers at that time who had access to people who were around King John. So he was particularly distressed about trial by jury because it made him king in name only. If that's his reaction, that can only mean that the jurors were to be judges of the law itself, and that any law that he wanted to pass had to pass their tribunal. And then of their own conscience, not the directive of the judge, the jury was to decide if a law was worthy of being enforced. If Magna Carta and trial by jury was not what Spooner claims that it was, and what centuries of English law and historical documentation claim it was, then why would King John so feverishly seek to have it annulled? Why even go through the process of sending communication off to the Pope if it wasn't what Spooner says it was? The historical revisionists that I've seen don't have a satisfactory answer to that question. The irony, of course, is that those claiming to champion a free society vehemently attack the one thing that can guarantee it. And their arguments, which once we get into how it's been subverted, the arguments typically boil down to just mere pragmatism, rather than any sort of a principled respect for individual consent, which they also fraudulently profess to be the glory of our system. Trial by government is none of those things, and that is the system that they are so desperate to maintain. Spooner's next proof in his line of logical arguments is the nitty-gritty of the Latin that the Magna Carta was actually written in. And as I said, we're going to go ahead and skip that for now. And tonight we're instead going to focus on the first section of Chapter 3, the weakness of regal authority. Section 1 begins with Spooner quoting Henry Hallam, a partially overlapping contemporary of Spooner's, although he's British. He heavily researched the early legal forms and practices of the Saxons, and he was part of that. If you recall back to the excerpt I read from Wikipedia as a good distillation of the common revisionist arguments, He was part of the scoff, that resurgence of interest in ancient trial by jury that these revisionists love to claim helped invent the interpretation we're discussing here. But Hallam goes ahead and says, and this is Spooner quoting him, the Franks, Lombards, and Saxons, these Germanic tribes, seem alike to have been jealous of judicial authority and averse to surrendering what concerned every man's private right out of the hands of his neighbors and equals. And if you want to go and look that up for yourself, that is from Henry Hallam's View of the State of Europe during the Middle Ages. Spooner then comments that the judicial authority here spoken of was the authority of the kings, who at that time united the office of both legislators and judges, and not of a separate department of government called the judiciary, like what has existed in more modern times. Now, to this, I would add that it is evident from our own history and the history of previous free peoples that the primary ingredient in an actually free culture is the indwelling of a hunger for and obstinate insistence of the exercise of our natural rights. American culture has long professed to have this hunger, but it has been subverted by debilitating euphemism. It's a shadow of a reality we believe we have. In that case, Plato's cave is more relevant and descriptive than ever before. We are not free, but we celebrate freedom. We have no actual liberty, but we proclaim our natural rights. We declare personal sovereignty, but we beg for permission at the voting booth. If we take historical precedent as a guide, America will never be the land of the free until we reject our nonsensical platitudes, call a spade, and I believe strongly we must reclaim our trial by jury heritage. Spooner then goes on to build the case of the weakness of regal authority, or regal / royal authority. And now he is going to quote from David Hume. Spetzel brought him up in one of the first couple of episodes, and so clearly Spooner was aware of Hume. And there are some things that he does agree with him on, especially Hume's approach and treatment of the historical record. So we have here Hume, who was drawing upon the writings of Tacitus, who was a Roman senator around 100 AD. He wrote a book called Germania, and it was a commentary on the Germanic tribes that Rome fought viciously to subdue. So Hume is pulling from information that is derived from there, and then also from his understanding of Saxon culture that grew out of those Germanic tribes. And Hume writes, the government of the Germans and that of all the northern nations who established themselves on the ruins of Rome was always extremely free. And those fierce people, accustomed to independence and inured to arms, were more guided by persuasion than authority in the submission which they paid to their princes. The military despotism which had taken place in the Roman Empire, and which, previously to the eruption of those conquerors, had sunk the genius of men and destroyed every noble principle of science and virtue, was unable to resist the vigorous efforts of a free people, and Europe, as from a new epoch, rekindled her ancient spirit and shook off the base servitude to arbitrary will and authority under which she had so long labored. The free constitutions then established, however impaired by the encroachments of succeeding princes, still preserved an air of independence and legal administration which distinguished the European nations. And if that part of the globe maintained sentiments of liberty, honor, equity, and valor superior to the rest of mankind, it owes these advantages chiefly to the seeds implanted by those generous barbarians. I wish that the title "Generous Barbarians" had been something Spooner had written. Either way, I'm quite happy to refer to myself as a generous barbarian. I would also like maybe dip my toe into this topic here. This notion of superior to the rest of mankind. This declaration of liberty, this understanding of liberty, and this ingenious invention to the end of protecting liberty seems to have really only found the footing that it did in the Anglo-Saxon or in the Saxon culture, and that's interesting. It might be informative to why there is such an aggressive, destructive campaign against European heritage and culture. If there is any truth to the matter of history being rewritten to obscure certain facts and certain truths, it could be that this is one of those things that they would very much like to keep hidden. And if you're going to think of Germans, they want you to think of Nazis, not think of probably the most free people that have ever lived. Sidebar. That quote, by the way, was from Hume's essay of the Rise and Progress of the Arts and Sciences. It was published in 1742. But Spooner goes on to quote more Hume, again, furthering the idea that the Saxon royalty was not the universal sovereigns that we tend to think of kings being. But Hume writes, the Saxons who subdued Britain, as they enjoyed great liberty in their own country, obstinately retained that invaluable possession in their new settlement. They imported into this island the same principles of independence which they had inherited from their ancestors. And this, of course, makes logical sense, because you're not likely just to abandon your core principles. And if we apply this to a modern situation, we often get frustrated and lament how hardcore commies, when fleeing the disaster their policies have wreaked on their former states, fly to a new state, and they don't have the humility and presence of mind to abandon their ideology, so they turn around and make the new state just as much of a pigsty as the previous one. So on the flip side of that, in a positive sense, these Saxons, once they came to England or to Britain, having that hunger and passion for liberty, were more likely to continue that hunger in their new land rather than abandon it, especially as they were able to find more open space and freedom, because the continent was apparently getting a little bit congested, at least in the areas they had dominance in. Spooner then goes on to quote James Stewart, who is an 18th century Scottish historian and political theorist, to flesh out how that Saxon insistence on liberty played out in the form of a weaker monarch. And this is from a 1778 essay or book, I'm not sure exactly what it was, called The View of Society in Europe in its Progress from Rudeness to Refinement. James Stewart writes, the authority of the Saxon monarch was not more considerable. The Saxons submitted not to the arbitrary rule of princes. They administered an oath to their sovereigns, which bound them to acknowledge the laws and defend the rights of the church and people. Again, oaths are meaningless if the people who have been sworn to don't hold the swearer to his oath. And so to that point, Stewart writes, if they forgot this obligation, they forfeited their office. And the smallest violation of ancient usage, or the least step towards tyranny, was always dangerous and often fatal to them being the kings. Interestingly, Stewart writes that they were not allowed to impose taxes on the kingdom. We have tales of the Robin Hood era of burdensome taxes. That was the Norman era. The Anglo-Saxon era did not suffer that sort of affront to personal liberty and property. Stewart goes on to say, they, that is the king, declared war, it is said, and made peace. In both cases, however, they acted as the instruments of the state and put in execution the resolutions which its councils had decreed. If indeed an enemy had invaded the kingdom and its glory and its safety were concerned, the great lords took to the field at the call of their sovereign. But had a sovereign declared war against a neighboring state without wow, my tongue just froze my mouth. Without requiring their advice, or if he meant to revenge by arms an insult offered to him by a subject, a haughty and independent nobility refused their assistance. They considered these they considered as the quarrels of the king and not of the nation. and in all such emergencies, he could only be assisted by his retainers and dependents. I thought this was an interesting point that gets brought out because it kind of brings to mind the issues of today with the actions of President Trump in regards to Venezuela. And I'm not going to pretend that I know what's going on there. But I will say that whatever is going on there, and whatever the reasons are for whatever is going on there, I believe my personal obligation under natural law is I can still demand from any who would be king that they need to honor natural law. I don't really like the idea of America going into other countries and arresting anybody, really. But I can't necessarily control that. What I can control is myself. So I can at least hold myself to the same ruthless standard of abiding by natural law. And even if the king doesn't, King Donald, then I will still hold myself to the same ruthless standard. And that can play out in how I would participate in a jury. Of course, the active word in first principles is principles. And if they can just be replaced at whim based on superficial circumstances that, to Chris's point, we don't even have reliable information about, then you can never really claim to be a principled person. And I don't want to claim to be a principled person because it looks good. I value being a principled person. I want to be around other principled people. So that's how I would like to live. Plus, I want to be honoring and pleasing to God, and that's what he requires of us. Stuart goes on, nor must we imagine that the Saxon, any more than the German monarchs, succeeded each other in a lineal descent. So again, this is illustrating the weakness of regal authority, or that they disposed of the crown at their pleasure. In both countries, the free election of the people filled the throne, and their choice was the only rule by which the princes reigned. The succession, accordingly, of their kings was often broken and interrupted, and their depositions were frequent and groundless. The will of a prince whom they had long respected, and the favor they naturally transferred to his descendant, made them often advance him to the royal dignity. But the crown of his ancestors he considered as the gift of the people, and neither expected nor claimed it as a right. Now, there's a mention in there of free election of the people, and I didn't really pull on that thread. There's not a lot of information that I can really find about that to where I would feel comfortable saying that the primary focus of a Saxon had less to do with an electoral process and more about the legal process, because ultimately legal liberty is vastly more important than electoral liberty, I would say. Now, James Stewart, the man that Spooner has been quoting here, he relies heavily, often implicitly, on preserved Saxon law codes. These include the laws of Ethelbert, Ine, Alfred the Great, and Edward the Elder. If you are interested in tugging on any of those threads, I recommend you do so. It's fun to kind of nerd out on this stuff and look back and see what we actually have preserved. And what these codes show, what the preservation shows, that there was a heavy use of local courts. There was an interesting way that Anglo-Saxon society was organized. You have things like tithings, hundreds, and shires, and then counties, and so on. A lot of that is preserved in some of our language. So, for instance, the word sheriff is a relic of that time. It comes from shire, reeve, shire being a collection of multiple hundreds, which 100 is a collection of 100 houses. So you have several hundred houses have a sheriff who is essentially the officer of the court, and reeve means officer. So shire, reeve, sheriff is what we have today. I found that interesting. And an implicitly decentralized system, this shires and hundreds and so on, wherein the community responsibility played out in the free people actually actively participating in their own self-governance. You never really encountered that self-governance unless you actively violated natural law. If you're just one of those people that can't get their act together, you're stealing, you're murdering, you're lying, you're cheating, you're defrauding, then you would find yourself on the business end of this decentralized legal system. It relied heavily on communal responsibility. Some of you in the chat have mentioned how the essence of trial by jury is that jurors are supposed to know you, like the community is supposed to recognize each other. And in the Saxon times, that was certainly an element, because there was a concept called compurgation, which is the under oath, the opinions of upstanding members of the community vouching for the person who's been accused. I know he's a man of good character, and I so swear before God. And that was counted as evidence in their proceedings. I'm not saying that should be the way it should be done now, but that was illustrative of how the community was involved with one another. The lack of centralization and the lack of a professional judiciary class that drew its authority from the crown to make decrees by fiat was certainly a hallmark of this system as well. And as such, there was limited royal initiative in any sort of adjudicating process. Sometimes the king might step in and give his opinion on something if it was a higher profile case, but in general, the king let the people govern and judge themselves. The king's responsibility was to protect against evasion and to make sure that the ancient law codes were actually being followed. Moving on to another source, Spooner then quotes Robert Henry, who in his book History of Great Britain wrote that nothing can be more evident than this important truth, that our Anglo Saxon kings were not absolute monarchs, but that their powers and prerogatives were limited by the laws and customs of the country. Our Saxon ancestors had been governed by limited monarchs in their native seats on the continent, and there is not the least appearance or probability that they relinquished their liberties and submitted to absolute government in their new settlements in this island. It is not to be imagined that men whose reigning passion was the love of liberty would willingly resign it, and their new sovereigns, who had been their fellow soldiers, had certainly no power to compel them to such a resignation. This is echoing a sentiment that we've already touched on with that quote I read from Henry Hallam from David Hume, that the Saxons, once they came to England, it doesn't make any sense that they would give up their autonomy and would suddenly let a king be a despotic ruler over them. And it's a logical argument, similar to one that Spooner makes in regards to his proofs with Magna Carta, that the barons didn't go through all the trouble of a civil war and winning just to hand the king back his exact kingdom. This logical similarity just goes to show you, by the way, that who you listen to or who you read does indeed have an impact on your own ability to think and reason. I've wondered, as I've read through a lot of this stuff, if Spooner resonated with these various people that he's quoting because they align with his already formulated political worldview, logical worldview, or if they actually had a part in forming that worldview. And it might be a mixture of both. Spooner was middle-aged by the time he wrote this, but he was an active and voracious reader for the majority of his life. And so it's easy to see him coming across these highly respected men in their writings in the 1700s and 1800s, 1600s as well. And it's logical that he would come across their writings and then that would influence his thought process. But to borrow from like a nutritional analogy, you are what you eat. So to that, I would encourage everyone to watch what you're reading and watch what you let your kids read and make sure that they're not just consuming a bunch of garbage. It's okay to have junk food in every now and again, but that can't be your main course. Sermonizing aside, Spooner moves on to a French historian named Paul de Rapin, He's a French historian. He focused on local institutions of power rather than larger scale geopolitical ones. And given the Germanic history that even the French have, the name of the country, France, comes from the Franks or the Francs, or however you want to pronounce that. And those were people that did have Germanic tribal roots. So this is in their DNA as well, although DNA is fake. More on that later. He writes, there are but two things the Saxons did not think proper to trust their kings with. For being of like passions with other men, they might very possibly abuse them. We'll get to those two things in a minute, but the notion that a person, upon becoming a public servant, imbued with fantastic power, will not suddenly or eventually succumb to the temptations of that power is patently ridiculous. That was one of my main criticisms of Thomas Hobbes and his political philosophy, that it was not well received when I would bring that stuff up in political science classes. But the Saxons, it seems, better understood human nature than we, who profess to be so much more advanced. But the two things that they did not think proper to trust their kings with were, namely, the power of changing laws enacted by consent of king and people, and the power of raising taxes at pleasure. When kings arose, as some there were, that aimed at absolute power by changing the old and making new laws at pleasure, by imposing illegal taxes on the people. This excellent government being, in a manner, dissolved by these destructive measures, confusion and civil wars ensued, which some very wrongfully ascribed to the fickle and restless temper of the English. This is from his History of England. D. Rapin. It's DE space RAPIN, if you want to look that up. Revisionist historians would point to the civil wars of the fickle and restless temper of the English as being evidence for the weakness of the operative political system rather than its strength. You might say these revisionist historians, by the way, were some of the original operatives raising the hue and cry over unity, as if unity under tyranny was a virtue to be ascended to. Given how long the operative political system truly flourished, at least 700 years, probably longer, because if you take into consideration the fact that these were cultural values that predated the Romans, as I mentioned earlier, you could have, there was obviously evolution to some degree of the culture, but the foundational values of the culture were, by the time Magna Carta came around, were at least 1,500 years old at that point. It's reasonable to make that assertion. So the commentary by historians with a statist bent that paints a picture of the Saxon period as essentially the English version of the later American Wild West should be a red flag to the validity of their observations. And at some point, I'll do a sidebar on why I would put something like Wild West in quotes. Anytime any mainstream historian is going to paint the picture of a wild and crazy time, it should raise a red flag to you and think, maybe they're probably wrong. It's worth looking into, at least to verify for yourself. Now, by a way of recap here, because I know we're kind of getting into some dense stuff here. Anglo-Saxon culture, preserving its Germanic tribal roots that extended well before the Roman Empire, had a solid foundation of recognition of personal liberty and the dangers of centralized power structure. This is exemplified in the dispersal of legal activity to the hierarchy of legal authorities with the hundreds and the shires and tithings and counties and so on. And if you enjoy history, it's worth reading about how those worked, but for our purposes here, it's sufficient to just acknowledge their existence. Although I will point out that from what I can tell, it wasn't a top-down governance structure wherein the shires lorded it over the hundreds and then the hundreds over the tithings and then the tithings over the family, but it was more of a bottom-up flow of more difficult cases that needed a broader audience, bigger pool of wisdom or so on, you could appeal in that system. And so you could appeal up to the shire, similar to the way our system is done today, but it was always still adjudicated by a jury of people that were randomly selected. So it wasn't like the king pushed things down through them and they all had like squeezing power on the lower levels. That's just not the way it worked. So we are discussing the weakness of regal authority. And so Spooner then on his own expands on the men that he's already quoted. And he writes, but although the king himself had so little authority that it cannot be supposed for a moment that his laws were regarded as imperative by the people, it has nevertheless been claimed in modern times by some who seem determined to find or make a precedent for the present legislative authority of Parliament, or Congress, that his laws were authoritative when assented to by the, I'm going to totally screw up the pronunciation of this, it's the Witena Yamote, I think, or it can be pronounced Witena Gemot, but it's apparently the G can be a Y. So Witena Gemot, or the assembly of wise men, that is the bishops and barons. So far, the focus has been on the bottom-up legal structure. I've mentioned the hundreds and the shires, but with the mention of the Witena Gemot, we now see evidence of some top-down legal proceedings. But it is apparent that this was an aspect of the already mentioned attempts by a monarch to persuade compliance. So the Saxon monarch was not someone who lorded it over people, but someone who ruled more by persuasion. And one of the ways that he would do that was by the assembly of his witan, sometimes it's also called. And I'm going to stick with that because that's a lot easier to say. Spooner writes that this assembly evidently had no legislative power whatever. The king would occasionally invite the bishops and barons to meet him for consultation on public affairs, simply as a council and not as a legislative body. If they were agreed upon what ought to be done, the king would pass a law accordingly. And the barons and bishops would then return and inform the people orally what laws had been passed, and use their influence to induce them to conform to the law of the king and the recommendation of the council. And the people, no doubt, were much more likely to accept a law of the king if it had been approved by this council. Now, regarding this witan, or Witena Gemot, Spooner makes a series of arguments regarding the non-factor that it actually played. And one of the main arguments for that is the sparse presence in the history of English legislation during that time. And I'll get to more on that in just a minute. Spooner writes, it's ridiculous to suppose that the assent of such an assembly gave any authority to the laws of the king, which is an argument that some people try to make, or had any influence in securing obedience to them other than by way of persuasion. If this body had any real legislative authority, such as is accorded to the legislative bodies of the present day, they would have made themselves at once the most conspicuous portion of the government, and would have left behind them abundant evidence of their power, instead of the evidence simply of their assent to a few laws passed by the king. So we have record of laws passed by the king that don't have the witan's approval marked on it. So you kind of had a both-and situation. And if you juxtapose that with the Congress that we have today, and then referring to Chris Paul's The Fake News, Today is the History of Tomorrow, a historian 100 years from now, or 1,000, would have no difficulty in finding the stamp of Congress or state legislatures or any of these legislative bodies we have today. They would find records of them everywhere. They're think of Una Penuna Banca and all the press that she's tried to garner over the last couple of years. But what we have from the Anglo Saxon culture, and I don't have that audio clip, I should, because I mentioned her name, and man, now there's like going to be a tear in the matrix because I didn't play that audio clip. I will fix that and make sure it's on hand at some point. But what we have today preserved from the Anglo Saxon era is like the exact opposite of that. You don't have record after record after record after record of the Witan. You have every once in a while it was mentioned. Spooner goes on building that point that more than this, if this body had had any real legislative authority, they would have constituted an aristocracy, having in conjunction with the king absolute power over the people. Assembling voluntarily, merely on the invitation of the king, deputed by nobody but themselves, representing nobody but themselves, responsible to nobody but themselves, their legislative authority, if they had any, or had any, would of necessity have made the government of an aristocracy merely, and the people slaves, of course. And this would necessarily have been the picture that history would have given us of the Anglo-Saxon government and of Anglo-Saxon liberty, but it's not. Therefore, you know, as some historians like to do, you can't point to the Witan and say that was like a proto-parliament and had all this authority, and was inferior to Parliament because Parliament was elected, eventually elected by the people, because that matters. Slide 50. Oops, I jumped up ahead. Whoops-a-daisy. Lost my train of thought here. Still boarding at the station. More than this. Oh, okay, here we are. Slide 15, I was right. So the fact that the people had no representation in this assembly, and the further fact that through their juries alone, they nevertheless maintained that noble freedom, the very tradition of which, after the substance of the thing itself has ceased to exist, has constituted the greatest pride and joy of the nation to this day, prove that this assembly exercised no authority which juries of the people acknowledged, except at their own discretion. Comparatively, if I am preparing for any significant decision in my own life, and I'm wanting to make a wise choice, because who wouldn't, I, like many of you, I'm sure, will expand my counsel base, and I try to actively maintain relationships with people I respect so I can have access to their wisdom, among other things. But in no way do I consider their counsel to be authoritative in my life. The decision remains mine. The consequences remain mine. And in this way, I, and I'm sure many of you who might follow a similar pattern, would echo the form of Anglo-Saxon culture. The king is more of an advisory guardian role. The Witanagemote is an advisory guardian role, not authoritative. And you can see then why I have grown to have tremendous respect for what the Anglo-Saxons were able to accomplish, and really why I increasingly view them, even more than our founders, as the examples we should appeal to for moving ahead in the golden age. Now, speaking to the jury as the de facto government of the Anglo-Saxons, Spooner writes, there is not a more palpable truth in the history of the Anglo-Saxon government than that stated in the introduction to Sir Geoffrey Gilbert's History of the Court of Common Pleas. And he quotes Geoffrey Gilbert here, that the county and hundred courts, to which should have been added the other courts in which juries sat, the courts baron and the court leet, in those times were the real and only parliaments of the kingdom. And why were they the real and only parliaments of the kingdom? Solely because, as will hereafter be shown, the juries in those courts tried causes on their intrinsic merits, according to their own ideas of justice. This is foreshadowing the next section about juries being courts of conscience. Irrespective of the laws agreed upon by kings, priests, and barons, and whatever principles they uniformly or perhaps generally enforced, and none others became practically the law of the land as a matter of course. And finally, on this point, conclusive proof that the legislation of the king was of little or no authority is found in the fact that the kings enacted so few laws. Spooner doesn't spend a whole lot of time on this, and this is something I have also not done a huge amount of digging on. But Spooner does provide that the Code of Alfred would not fill 12 pages of the Statute Book of Massachusetts, and was little or nothing else than a compilation of the laws of Moses and the Saxon customs, evidently collected from the considerations of convenience rather than enacted on the principle of authority. The Code of Edward the Confessor would not fill 20 pages of the Statute Book of Massachusetts, and, says Blackstone, seems to have been no more than a new edition or fresh promulgation of Alfred's Code or Dome Book, with such additions and improvements as the experience of a century and a half suggested. Imagine that. An entire country's legal book being 12 pages. That's because they had natural law to rely on. You don't really need to say, you put a law in the books regarding murder, like people can figure that out. Spooner says, how is this abstinence from legislation on the part of the ancient kings to be accounted for, except on the supposition that the people would accept and juries enforce few or no new laws enacted by their kings? Plainly, it can be accounted for in no other way. That is a really interesting perspective and argument, because if the Saxon kings were these totalitarian monarchs, which is what we're sort of led to think that because of the way we view a monarch. Oh, monarchies are terrible. If they were that way, then we would have records of them being more legislative in the way that they acted, and we don't have those records. Instead, we have records to the opposite of that. Now, in conclusion, I know we're drifting over an hour here. We are dissecting Spooner's overall case for trial by jury being the palladium of liberty. Palladium being a protection of, security for. So far, Spooner's case is, when we covered in the first couple of episodes, it's trial by jury or trial by country versus trial by government. Excuse me, that's what we have today. And to support his definition, or to support his arguments for trial by jury, we went into like the definition of it and how definitionally it must be the way he describes it to be. And then he moves on to historical proof. And we looked at the Magna Carta, we looked at the actions of the barons, we looked at the response of John. Spooner includes the language of Magna Carta. We haven't gone into that. We skipped over that for tonight. And the next line in his argument that he's building is the chapter entitled Additional Proofs of the Rights and Duties of Jurors. And we began with a discussion that we did tonight, demonstrating the historical record shows that the regal authority in Anglo-Saxon England and even the Saxon era previous to that, since it makes logical sense, they brought the ideas over with them when they came to England, is that regal authority was not dominant. It was not authoritarian. It was rather weak. They were guardians. They were not the source of law. So here in chapter 3, we're beginning to establish that. And as I mentioned, when Anglo-Saxon culture was imported over, they brought all these ideas with them. They even brought the concepts of the hundreds and the shires. These are all carryovers from the continent, and stretch back, like I said, 1,200, maybe even 1,500 years. It's difficult to get information on the Germanic tribes prior to the Roman interactions with them, but from the records, like I mentioned, Tacitus, there's descriptions of cultures that already exist. So there was already, a long-standing culture that was flourishing at the time, and actually the nature of the Saxon and Lombard and Frank cultures being highly decentralized, and each of those warriors highly valuing their own personal liberty, it made it nearly impossible for the Romans to conquer them. And that alone should let you know, like, hey, maybe there's something about the way they did things if it's that hard to conquer a decentralized tribe. I maintain, to close out here, that it makes no sense to get involved locally. If your involvement is simply to support the centralization structure and the lack of any mention of any robust electoral system in that culture, there was some mentions of some election processes, but it was not a major feature of that system. That should inform you that our safety does not really lie in that direction, that in the electoral process. Even without the heritage of the Anglo Saxon culture, our own experience over the last 250 years should be enough to inform you of that, at least I think. Spooner's insistence on, if you recall back from our discussion on natural law and natural law contracts from the first few episodes, Spooner's insistence on the universally individual consent, which is something that the current and probably all election systems cannot guarantee, is really only truly satisfied with a trial by jury system. And the way the Saxons pulled it off is probably as close as mankind has ever gotten to truly honoring consent of the governed. Now, next week, we will continue the additional proofs by looking at section 2 of chapter 3, which speaks to juries as being courts of conscience, which is a direct assault on the modern notion that juries are merely judges of fact, and they're not allowed to think on their own about the law. They're supposed to think about the law the way the judge tells them they must, which is an absolute travesty of justice. And so with that, I appreciate you all joining me for this evening, and I'll look forward to seeing you all next week, which is, I think, ahead. I should be able to do that episode live, but we'll see how the week goes. Anyway, take care, everybody. See you soon.
Why a spoon, cousin? Why not an axe?
Because it's dull, you twit. It'll hurt more.
Thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to hit the thumbs up on this video. And a special thank you to all of our advertising partners. Please remember to shift your dollars to support those businesses that support Badlands Media.